Boys and girls, your attention, please.
First of all, I'd like to make a little statement.
Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast.
All of your friends are welcome here at any time.
The introduction isn't really so complicated, is it?
Good manners make good first impressions. It's a simple enough matter to give people you meet plenty of room to pass.
Try to understand another person's viewpoint.
That's a rather simplified suggestion of a complex mental process, but you get the idea.
You have almost certainly heard of the opioid crisis. You know that there is one. But what does that mean, really? Well, the standard story goes something like this. In the late 1990s, pharmaceutical companies pulled wool over the eyes of the medical community at large. They told them that patients would not become addicted to prescription opioid pain relievers. Then, healthcare providers began to prescribe them en masse. This led to widespread diversion and misuse of these medications before it became clear that they could, indeed, be highly addictive. Before long, opioid addiction and opioid overdose rates began to skyrocket, leading us into the crisis that we find ourselves in today.
More Americans are dying because of drugs than ever before. We've never seen anything like this.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, the nation is in the grip of a fast-moving epidemic for which there are no easy solutions.
The opioid epidemic finally became one of the biggest stories of 2017 as the number of people dying from Big Pharma's prescription narcotics reached levels that not even corporate media could ignore.
We're going to look at one of the major causes of this crisis, prescription painkillers, which are chemical cousins of heroin. Around 75% of heroin users started with a prescription opioid, drugs like OxyContin, Vicodin, and
According to
Percocet.
the
Some
Centers
take
for Disease
Recreation
Control,
and others
the
take
nation is in
prescribed
the grip of
However, it starts,
the
the
nation
level
is
gets out of hand.
It sounds like an unfortunate unfolding of events, but the story's a simple one. And one might hope that a simple story might also mean a simple solution. But despite our best efforts, we've yet to slow the rate of death related to drugs in our country. In the year 2016, there were 64,000 total drug-related deaths. Something's not working, and that truth is getting increasingly difficult to stomach. So I did something crazy. I set out to challenge the standard story about the opioid crisis. My hope is that after listening to this series, you will be able to form a more complete story of your own. I spent the last 2 years speaking to experts who have spent their lives thinking, writing, and speaking about this topic. I asked them, is there something wrong with, something missing from, our standard story? The answer was a resounding yes. The story we've been told about drugs, addiction, and the opioid epidemic is incomplete. And not only that, but the term opioid crisis itself may be a misnomer. For one, what we call opioid-related deaths almost never involve only opioids. These tragedies happen often as a result of drug mixing and drug poisoning. This is something we'll talk about soon enough. But there's another, more fundamental problem. The standard story implies that there is a crisis of addiction. It's not completely clear that's true. To turn that into a falsifiable claim, we first have to define addiction, which it turns out is actually not an easy thing to do. We don't really have a workable and agreed upon definition of addiction. For some clarity on this, I turned to one of the world's leading experts on the concept of addiction. This is psychologist and author Dr. Stanton Peele.
I'm Stanton Peele, and I've been writing, thinking, and researching and treating addiction since the early 1970s. I wrote a book with Archie Brodsky called Love and Addiction, in which I presaged most of the developments that I think have occurred in the last 40 to 50 years, that addiction isn't simply a result of using drugs. Most people use drugs without being addicted, on the one hand. And on the other hand, addiction is a valuable concept, but for it to be useful, it has to be applied in a way that goes beyond drugs and isn't dependent on the characteristics of drugs, but rather describes a cyclical process that people become engaged in with any powerful involvement.
People think that there is an opioid crisis in the first place, and they think there's an opioid overdose crisis. And then also people think, insofar as there is a crisis, that pharmaceutical industries handed it to us. To what extent are any of these things true, and to what extent aren't they?
In the long history of American approaches to addiction, we tend to demonize substances. That's the way Americans in particular approach it. And we've spread that view around the world. It's not natural in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, take Italy and wine, they don't think, oh, this thing is a horrible poison. And the United States wasn't that way always either. In revolutionary America, alcohol was God's good creature. The temperance movement arose at a specific point in history around 1830. It culminated in what we all know to be national prohibition in 1920. But for a century, Americans fought over whether alcohol was good or bad, and temperance developed a language and a mythology of alcohol being inherently evil. And to a large extent, but not entirely, most people in New York City and Burlington, Vermont, reject that imagery, but it's surprisingly present in the United States and in many parts of the United States. People don't realize that barely over 50% of Americans drink alcohol if you define that as having more than one drink a month. In the meantime, that temperance evil concept got applied to drugs, and the Harrison Act was passed in 1914, and we declared cocaine, heroin, and with it marijuana inherently evil. So the demonization of substances is highly Americanized, it's highly politicized, but it has always entangled medicine along with it. Medicine has been thought of as providing that justification. And within that framework, we have periodic drug scares. The Harrison Act was passed in the middle of a drug scare, where heroin was basically, and cocaine were basically legal, and people weren't especially upset when they learned that somebody used heroin. All of a sudden, that person became an outcast, and they were ruled out of normal society. And heroin and opiates were relegated to the inner city and to jazz musicians and to derelicts. And we changed the whole image of drugs. And what's happened in the century since then is that accidental association has been disassociated. To a large extent now, many people don't so closely put those things together. In particular, we're legalizing marijuana. So that's been taken outside of the mix. But that temperance attitude, the demonization of substances remains. And as I wrote in Diseasing America, in large part, that comes from an American unwillingness and inability to address issues socially. Americans don't do well with social policy. We tend to medicalize things. We've always done that with addiction. We've done that consistently throughout by saying drugs cause addiction, therefore, let's eliminate drugs. We've gotten to a point now where that's impossible. I mean, leave aside that we haven't eliminated heroin. What we now pharmaceutically produce opiates and narcotics, which we've been doing, of course, from the start. Heroin was originally pharmaceutically produced as a replacement for morphine, which people felt was developing problems. And so now, how do we deal with that complicated reality? That the demonization of drugs, those drugs that periodically cause drug scares like China Cat or some new brand of heroin that's coming down the pike, how do we put that together with the fact that most opiates that are out there are produced synthetically or manufactured by pharmaceutical companies. And so we've got the hybrid drug scare, drug demonization of the modern era, which is, well, let's blame pharmaceutical companies. They're the evil drug dealers that used to lurk around in back alleys. We're still blaming the drug. And of course, you and I and others, we're not the only ones, point out it's a remarkably small percentage of people who are prescribed synthetic opioids and pharmaceutical opioids who become addicted to them. It's virtually non-existent. If that were the problem we were dealing with, there is no problem.
Dr. Peel says there is a problem, but the problem is not a function of prescription drugs. That is, it's not the drugs themselves that are addicting people. The true nightmare we're experiencing, he says, is a rising mortality rate among the people who take drugs, and our efforts to curb this trend are largely misdirected.
It's 1% at most of people who get a prescription for painkillers. And we sort of know that because if our child has a ligament injury, or they have an appendicitis, or they have a wisdom tooth pulled, they get an opioid prescription. They still do that. But now we have to face the fact that people say, well, wait a second, drugs are evil, they cause addiction. These are opioids, which used to be an argument against demonizing heroin, but now instead we're sweeping that in with heroin. And now we're coming up with the concept, well, how do you deal with that evil? And we've come up with new evildoers, pharmaceutical companies and doctors. And as I always say, I don't particularly defend pharmaceutical. I don't care about pharmaceutical companies, and I don't care that much about doctors. But they're producing a useful substance and prescribing it for people who require that substance.
You might wonder at this point if Stanton Peele is letting pharmaceutical companies off too easy. But he's certainly not alone in his line of thinking. Many addiction experts agree, including neuroscience journalist and best-selling author Maya Solovitz.
I'm Maya Solovitz. I am a writer and the author of Unbroken Brain, A Revolutionary New Way of Understanding Addiction, and I've basically written about addiction for the last almost 30 years. It's certainly the case that the pharmaceutical industry is not innocent in this situation. However, the idea that exposure turns people into addicts is simply false. The vast majority of people who are exposed to opioids do not become addicted. Something like 80 to 90% never become addicted. If you are talking about exposure in medicine, which generally people with chronic pain tend to be in their 40s or older, if you have not had a experience of heavy recreational drug use and or addiction by age 40, and you start taking opioids for pain, your odds of becoming addicted are roughly 1%. So they like to pretend that that's not true because that is what pharma indeed said. So what happened here is that we got into a false narrative. And the false narrative is this. Pharmaceutical companies claimed that opioids were not addictive, and they sold OxyContin massively, and they got a whole mess of pain patients addicted to opioids. What really happened was that they promoted OxyContin and other opioids massively, and lots of people ended up with them sitting around in their medicine cabinets. And then their teenagers and college students and other people who were already doing other recreational drugs found the pills, started selling the pills, and yes, became addicted. The biggest risk factor for becoming addicted to opioids is not medical exposure. It is having an interest in and history of recreational drug use. And I really hate the word recreational drug use, but I have not been able to figure out a better phrase for it. So what happens really is that, when you ask people, oh, where did you get the prescription opioids that you got addicted to? Something like 75% will say, oh, I got them from a friend, I got them out of my medicine cabinet, but they weren't prescribed to me, I got them from a family member, I got them from a drug dealer, I got them from, some party I was at. It doesn't, most people here are not getting addicted in medical settings.
You'll notice Maya's read on the situation squares with Stanton Peele's description. But I have a feeling some of you are not convinced that these two are on the right side of things here. Let me back up, actually. I don't want to get lazy about nuance. Neither of them are fans of pharmaceutical companies. Both have told me many times they think the business itself is corrupt. They just don't vilify the drugs that the pharmaceutical companies peddle. They don't buy into what's called the disease theory of addiction. The disease theory says that addiction is a chronic, relapsing brain disease, a disease some people are prone to and can be initiated by taking drugs. This model is lauded by NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. NIDA, embodied by the National Institute of Health, funds 90% of the world's drug research. Whether you believe the theory or not, you might notice a problem with this from a scientific perspective. Here, let me put it another way. The organization that has defined addiction is the same organization that does 90% of the world's research on addiction. It should come as no surprise that their funding is geared toward bolstering their own theory, not discrediting it. I asked a neuroscientist to help me understand the disease model and any warts it may have. His name is Mark Lewis. Lewis was a professor of neuroscientist at the University of Toronto and Radboud University, respectively. He's the author of 2 best-selling books, Memoirs of an Addicted Brain and The Biology of Desire. I called him at his home in the Netherlands. Here's a clip.
It's mostly what they call the dopamine system. So dopamine is an important neurotransmitter, neurochemical, and it gets manufactured deep down in the midbrain, and it gets sent up to a part of the brain called the striatum, which is in charge of goal seeking. And so when you are pursuing a goal, you get a shot of dopamine up from your midbrain to the striatum, which focuses all of your attention on that goal and also gives you a sense of drive or desire or a motivational push toward that goal. And dopamine, these things are very complicated, but what happens in a nutshell is that the dopamine system becomes more tuned into cues that are associated with drugs or booze or gambling or sex, if you're a sex addict, or smoking or whatever it is you're addicted to. The stimuli, the cues that are associated with that thing will start to drive dopamine into the striatum. And the striatum, the actual receptors in the striatum can change in density and how attuned they are. And the learning system changes. So the striatum is a pretty complicated structure. Part of it underlies impulsive responding. And we know that people are often impulsive when they're pursuing getting high. But another part of it is in charge of compulsive responding. So when things get pretty serious in addiction, behavior becomes more compulsive. And when that happens, another part of the striatum becomes more tuned in, and the cells in that region start firing more, which means the connection starts to change. Every time there's changes in behavior and changes in thought patterns, you're also getting brain changes. You're getting the growth of new synapses in some areas and the loss of synapses. That means connections between brain cells in other areas. So that's half of the story. And the other half is the prefrontal cortex, which I think most people know is responsible for judgment, decision making, self-regulation, all that good stuff. And the prefrontal cortex also seems to change when people have been addicted for some period of time. There's less communication between the prefrontal cortex and the striatum, so the prefrontal cortex doesn't have as much of a chance to ride out and use long-term thinking and, shall we say, rational judgment to control the goal-seeking tendency of the striatum. So all these psychological changes are mirrored by brain changes when people become addicted and remain addicted for some period of time. So the NIDA folks, the disease model folks, they focus on the long lastingness of these brain changes. And even they admit often that they're not necessarily permanent, but they can last for some extended period of time. And, a lot of this depends on severity. So for 80-90% of people who become addicted to something, they're going to get off it, whether it takes 4 years or 6 years or 8 years. And for a small percentage, they may not, and it may kill them, depending on what they're addicted to. But our perspective, those of us who go more for a learning model, is we focus on neuroplasticity and the idea that the brain continues to change throughout life. It's supposed to change. It's designed to change. Whenever we learn new habits, new skills, new ways of thinking and doing things, the brain is changing its synaptic structure, its wiring pattern. So that's what I focus on. And as far as evidence for that, you can look at the brain, and there are studies that show that, things change, shall we say, in other ways when people recover. But also the statistics show that, in fact, most addicts do recover. It depends on what you're addicted to. But, for example, for cocaine, the median period to recover is 4 years. For marijuana, it's 6 years. For alcohol, it's 12 years. Cigarettes are one of the hardest things to kick, but there's still a median time frame for recovery, which is 20-something years. And that means that it's not chronic. It changes back, or it changes forward, or development continues as people continue to grow, become more responsible, and take charge of their lives. So the idea of a chronic, pathological state just doesn't really make sense when you look at those statistics.
My 3 guest experts offer us a common insight. Addiction is something that can look very disease-like, but the term disease is metaphorical in a sense. And like all metaphors, misinterpreting it can do varying degrees of harm. Perhaps more useful than calling it a disease, addiction can be thought of as a normal developmental process or a learning process gone awry. This means that addiction is something that can be developed or learned, and just as important, it is a phenomenon a person can develop away from by learning how to achieve their goals and their desires in ways that align both their short-term and long-term interests. In this way, there's nothing about the term addiction that is specific to drugs. There's a distinction to be made then between dependence on a drug and an addiction to drugs. Dependence means that if you're regularly using a substance and you stop taking it, your body will have an adverse physical reaction to it. Diabetics are dependent on insulin. People who take SSRIs for depression are perhaps dependent on antidepressant medication. But the fact that they're dependent on these things does not imply with any certainty that they're also addicted to them. Here again is Maya Solovitz.
In the 70s and 80s, there was this big thing, physical addiction, physical dependence is, first of all, they said they were the same thing and that was what really mattered in addiction. So therefore, cocaine was not especially addictive. Now, this was before crack, I might add. I thought, so it's no big deal to do cocaine. It's just like people hyped up the fears about it just the way they had done about marijuana. So, all that stuff I was told about marijuana wasn't accurate. So, must be the same thing with cocaine. Well, that is not correct. And now we realize that what addiction is very different from physically needing a substance to function. Addiction is compulsive drug use or other behavior despite negative consequences. And so, this confusion still causes an awful lot of trouble because if we, the DSM used to dumbly call addiction dependence. So the official diagnosis was substance dependence. Right. And then you had to get into this ridiculous conversation, physical versus psychological dependence, as if psychological didn't have physical components and physical didn't have psychological. It was just really dumb. And it also meant that basically
I'm addicted to Prozac. Cocaine is not addictive. And anybody who is a pain patient who is taking opioids long term is also addicted. And actually, that is not the case.
This is of great significance. Drugs themselves cannot cause addiction. For addiction to develop, context is needed. There are dimensions of biology, psychology, and social setting that all work together. If addiction to opioids is not a function of the opioids themselves, then it's not so clear that there's a demon molecule inside of opiates and opioids that are addicting people. And perhaps what we're calling an addiction problem shouldn't really be defined, at least as such a monumental crisis. Again, that's not to say that there's no problem at all. The number of people dying by taking drugs is rising. Again, there is a problem. But as we've now become aware, we may not be defining the problem properly. You heard Maya Solovitz talk briefly there about pain patients who are prescribed opioids. That's what I want to get into now. There's a common idea that our problems with addiction and drug deaths can be solved by taking away opioids. It sounds like a simple solution. I suppose that's the allure. But as Maya mentioned, this idea is often paired with an incomplete idea about what addiction really is. There are likely many people with pain for whom taking painkillers on a regular basis is their best option. So reasonable people could argue that simple legal mandates on drug laws, including rules for doctors about what they are and aren't allowed to prescribe, could very well do more harm than good. And that's just what we've done. I spoke with Jacob Solom, a senior editor at Reason Magazine. He's been studying and reporting on drugs and addiction for decades, and he has been closely tracking and writing about our current trend in drug-related deaths, what might be causing them, and how these deaths do and don't relate to the prescribing of pain pills.
What is quite clear is that we have seen a very dramatic percentage increase in deaths, especially deaths related to heroin and deaths related to fentanyl, have just gone up very dramatically in the last few years. Yeah. And by the way, apparently out of all proportion to the increase in use, insofar as we can measure that. What you find is you've got, an increase of maybe 50% in the total number of heroin users based on the survey. At the same time that you're seeing the number of heroin-related deaths quintuple, right? That's pretty amazing. So what's going on? I mean, something is clearly going on that makes heroin more deadly, more dangerous, more likely to kill you. And if you're really worried about this situation, you need to try to get a handle on that. Why is that happening? And what kinds of harm reduction measures would help to make people less likely to die? That's the bottom line.
Jacob Solom then made me aware of something remarkable, crucial, and terrifying. The people dying of what are called opioid-related deaths are actually either dying from a mixture of prescription drugs, not pain pills themselves, or sometimes the cause of death was only assumed to have been opioid-related. That is, the cause of death was never technically examined, but it seemed to have all the markings of a death related to opioids, so why not flag it as such? I'm going to pause right here. We're about to get into the topic of drug deaths, and as you might expect, that story is just beginning. Leaving you hanging is precisely what I'm going to do, for now. Please tune in next week. We'll continue this talk on episode 2, Drug Fatalities. We're going to dive into the second part of my chat with Jacob Solom. We'll explore what have been coined opioid-related deaths. I'll be joined by many other insightful guests, and among them, a man whose heart-rending story is going to set the stage for the final episode, dedicated to people with similar stories. These people are medical patients with chronic pain. These folks are literally feeling the negative kickback from our current dominant cultural, political, and medical demonization of painkillers themselves. Many of them don't have the luxury of advocating for themselves publicly on a podcast or having philosophical conversations about them. They're in too much pain and that pain's being undertreated. That story and more are coming up in the next 2 weeks. Please keep tuning in. This is the Social Exchange Podcast. You're listening to a series called Where the Story Meets Pain. This is episode 1, Addiction. Today's conversation about addiction was a critical one. Addiction is one of many dimensions of a complex set of social issues that most of us simply call the opioid crisis. My guests today help me uproot our current cultural conception of addiction. Perversely, the concept of addiction, as it is now widely marketed, is, to quote Stanton Peele, a historical anomaly, one that has arisen independent of laboratory or epidemiological data about drug use. The concept has never reflected actual patterns of drug use. Addiction can't be described as a moral deficit, nor is it sufficient to describe it as a chemical disease. Now remember, the basis for pushing back on pain prescriptions in the first place boils down to 2 major claims. One is that people everywhere are becoming addicted as a function of their being prescribed. The second is that people are dying of opioid overdoses by virtue of that wave of addiction. So if the truth about addiction is anything like my guests say, perhaps I'm biased, but I have a feeling that it is anything like my guests say, then one of 2 main pillars have been kicked out from underneath the standard story of the opioid crisis. Next week, we'll see if it's possible to loosen the other leg. Again, join us next week for episode 2, Drug Fatalities.